Trying to find the book of Ruth. It is a short book, only 4 chapters, covers about 10 or 12 years in total, and it's kind of 3 pages in my Bible, just tucked away before Samuel, if you're looking for it in your Bibles there. But short as it is a really significant book. I both personally and in kind of the global history, I always thought that Ruth was my mum's favorite book in the Bible. And I was speaking to her on Thursday and said that I was speaking this weekend and I was going to be talking about Ruth. I said, "That's your favorite book in the Bible, isn't it?" And she backtracked. All these years, I thought it was my mum's favorite book. And she said, it's one of them, but it's not. So it shows what I know about my mum. I also think that at mine and Kerry's wedding, we had a reading from Ruth, but it's getting to be a long time ago now, and I might be wrong. So it's a significant book personally, but it's also significant in that there are some really big themes, important things for us to learn. In this book, one of them, just right off at the front, is how God's plan for salvation extends to all people. Now, we know as we're reading through the Bible, day by day and week by week, that God chose the Jewish people and that he's worked through them. But right from the start, going back to his promise to Abraham, and now it's showed again in the book of Ruth, we can clearly see how God has intended his kingdom to be open to all people, because Ruth was from Moab, not from the Jewish people, and yet she has a really significant role to play. We see in the book of Matthew that she's named personally in the list of the ancestry of Jesus that Matthew lists. So this woman, this foreign woman, not of the people of Israel, has a special place in God's plan. So we can see that God's heart is for all people. He's come to bring people from all nations, from all across the world, whether it's Israel, whether it's Moab, whether it's Scotland, all people from all backgrounds to be in his kingdom. But we're looking today just at chapter 1. So we'll go through a few background facts, seeing as we're starting out looking at this book, just to understand where we are and what's going on. But just incidentally, we haven't had a quiz today. So it's one of 2 books in the Bible named after women. Can anyone tell me what the other one is, apart from... Very good. Adele's straight out there with Esther, the other one. So what is going on in this book? A bit of background. We're looking, or it's set mainly in Moab, which is here on the chart. So we've read, or David read to us the part that says that Naomi and Elimelech travels from Bethlehem. So we see there's Bethlehem there in Judah, and they travel east of the Dead Sea to Moab, which is just there, which is a foreign nation. The author, we don't really know for sure, but it is widely considered that Samuel wrote the book. And the reason that people think that is because the book does refer to King David, but it doesn't refer to Solomon. So they think that it was probably written before Solomon became king, when Samuel was around. So it's not certain, but possibly Samuel wrote it. When did these things happen? Probably around 1100 BC. It tells us that it's when the judges ruled over Israel. And it's probably during the reign of Jair, is what scholars think, which was around 1126 to 1105 BC. When the judges ruled, it was a time generally of lawlessness. The people of Israel were turning away from God, and then they'd get themselves into all kinds of trouble, and then God would intervene and rescue them, and then they'd go away from God again. And there was that kind of cycle of them going away from God, God rescuing them going away from God, over and over again. We don't know much about Jair, as I've said. Judges 10 just tells us that he was a Gileadite who judged Israel for 22 years. And the only piece of biographical information we have is that he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys and had 30 cities called Havoth Jair. And that's pretty much all we know about him. But as we're looking at chapter 1 in Ruth in a bit more detail, I'm going to look at 3 main themes, and I've headed them with phrases that each start with the letters DMC to help us remember. So firstly, we're going to look at desperate circumstances, and then a magnificent daughter-in-law, and then a caring God, finally. So to start with, the desperate circumstances. We read right at the start that there's a famine in Israel, and Naomi's husband Elimelech has taken his family from Bethlehem, which we saw on the chart there on the map, Bethlehem in Judah, to Moab, which, as I've said, is a land east of the Dead Sea. And that was started way back in Genesis. We read about Moab the first time when Lot had a relationship with his eldest daughter, and from that relationship, Moab was born. And Moab was an enemy of Israel. During the time of the Judges, way back at the start of the book, in Judges, we read about Moab as being one of the big nations of the time that oppressed Israel and kept them quite tightly restricted and controlled. And the story we read about Moab in Judges chapter 3 is about when Eglon was king of Moab, and he was taking tribute, taking money or whatever it was they paid to him from Israel. And there was the judge at the time who God raised up was called Ehud. And we read that he was a left-handed man, and Eglon, the king of Moab, was a very fat man. And Ehud went to give the tribute to King Eglon, and thrust the sword into his belly, but Eglon's kind of belly swallowed up the sword, so nobody knew that he was dead, and Ehud was able to escape, and that's how God rescued Israel at that time. But then, like I've said again, the cycle went around. His people disobeyed him. There were other powers that came in and oppressed Israel, and God had to intervene again. So that's the history between Moab and Israel. We've got Moab, which was a kind of ruling nation at the time that oppressed Israel, and Israel had escaped from them. But there's that enmity, that animosity between the nations, so they're enemies of each other. And then we read about Elimelech. And one of the things to pay attention to in the book of Ruth is the names. All of the names in the book have meanings. For example, Naomi means pleasant. And Elimelech means my God is king. But Elimelech took his family to Moab, away from Israel, the land that God had chosen, to an enemy nation. So his name means my God is king, but he seems to be moving in the wrong direction. Now, he didn't intend to stay in Moab forever. The word used in the Bible, or my translation at least, is sojourn. So he intended to stay there for a while there was a famine in Israel, and then go back. But it does seem that he's moving away from God to some extent. And we read as well, it happened after he died, but Naomi was alone with her two sons, and they married foreign women, which went against what God had told his people to do. So it seems this family didn't intend to stay in Moab forever, but were kind of drifting away from God, moving in that direction. And I've said the names mean things, and we see the names of their sons also mean something. We've got Mahlon, that means sick, and Chilion, which means pining. And those seem to be pretty accurate descriptions, because we read that both of the sons died in Moab, as well as Elimelech. So Naomi was left on her own with Orpah and Ruth, her sons' wives. And at that point, we read that God again has intervened to save his people, just like he did all the way through the book of Judges. A famine had come, and then God has visited his people again and given them food. So another theme that we see in the book of Ruth, and I'll pick up on again later, is a God who cares for his people. Yes, there are difficult circumstances, and yes, his people are suffering and crying out, and God responds. He provides for his people in this famine, provides food again. So I'll come back to that later on, but just now I want to look at the three women that are described in this book in a bit more detail, and we'll go to the second heading of magnificent daughter-in-law, because Naomi, when she hears that the famine in Judah has ended, decides that she's going to go back. She's going to return to Bethlehem from where she came. Imagine how difficult that would be for Ruth and Orpah to even think about going to Israel. Two Moabite widows. Now, widows usually had a pretty low status anyway. They had no one to support them or provide for them. But then remember the history between these two people groups, Israel and Moab. As well as not having much to go to in Bethlehem or in Judah at all, these two women are enemies of the people who live there. So putting that into a modern context, imagine if, for example, a Ukrainian woman went to Russia to escape the war, and while she was there, her two sons married Russian women, and then her sons died. And this woman then, a Ukrainian woman, wanted to go back to Ukraine, with 2 Russian daughters-in-law. Think it'd be easy for those Russian women to go to Ukraine at the moment? That's the choice that Orpah and Ruth have to make. Now, I've put up there that You Choose book. I don't know if anybody has ever read that book. Libby's not in the room, so I can say me and Kerry can't stand that book. It's one that Libby, every time we'd say to Libby when she was younger, what story do you want to read tonight? And she'd say, you choose. Initially, I thought she meant that was for me to choose, but no, it meant that she wanted to read this book, and it's horrible. It's only about 12 pages long, but every page is kind of, you choose what kind of bed you want. You choose what kind of pet you want. And it took ages. The magical times, of course, the wonderful times, but it took ages going through this book with her, and she'd want to know what you wanted to choose, and then she'd choose, and then, and honestly, so Ruth and Orpah have a choice to make, and it's not an easy choice. And Naomi gives them a way out. She gives them a chance to stay in Moab with her blessing. And what would you expect them to do? Makes sense for them to stay. And the first time, it seems almost for politeness' sake, they refuse. They say, no, Naomi, we'll go with you. But Naomi responds. She reasons with them and says, well, I've got nothing for you. If you come back with me, there's nothing for you there. There's no chance that you're going to marry any of my other sons. I don't even have other sons. Would you wait for them? So stay in Moab. And at that, Orpah, who, as I've said, names mean things here. Orpah's name means stubborn. So she kisses her mother-in-law and decides that she's going to stay in Moab. She's going to do what makes sense, and she'll stay. But that's not Ruth's reaction. Ruth does something that's unexpected, something extraordinary even. And she decides that she's going to stay with Naomi and go back to Bethlehem. Ruth's name, incidentally, means friendship. And we see that put into practice in what Ruth does. She chooses loyalty. She stays with Naomi, even though Naomi offers her a third time a way out, to say, stay in Moab, stay there, where your life is, where all your roots are, where you've got a family. You've got no hope for the future if you go with me. She says you've got family in Moab. Moab's got different gods. They worship Chemosh, a different god entirely, a different religion structure. You stay where your life is. You stay where your roots are, your family. Stay where you've got a life and a future. And then we read Ruth's response, those famous words in verse 16. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And in verse 17, Ruth again speaks of the Lord God. So that indicates that she's staying with Naomi out of loyalty, out of friendship, but also something more. It's a real life example of what Paul writes about to the church in Thessalonica in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, where he writes that they turned away from idols to serve the living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven, who he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. This is exactly what Ruth is doing. She seems to have realized the truth, and she's turning away from those false gods in Moab, and she wants to follow the living God, to join his people, because she knows that he's true, and that's what holds her. That's what drives her to do what she does. She wants to stick with Naomi. She wants to go back to God's people because she realizes that he's the true God. So it might seem hopeless. It might lead to hardship or difficulty, rejection, poverty. But verse 18 tells us, no, that's what Ruth has set herself to do. She's determined. She is going to follow that true God. And we can see that attitude in the world today. Think of the Open Doors prayer meetings that Alison and James host. And we had one here a few Wednesday nights ago. We read stories in the Open Door prayer diaries, for example, about people who are rejected by their families, their societies. They're beaten, discriminated against, not able to work, turned out of homes and villages, all because they choose to follow Jesus, and yet they stand firm. They persevere. I don't know if you were here that Wednesday evening when we had the Open Doors night, but do you remember the story that Alison told us about Pastor Laxman? If you were here, a man from India, he was in the most recent Open Doors newsletter or magazine. And his story is astonishing. He first came to faith when his wife was healed from an illness. And after that, he was falsely accused by people around him. They reported him to the police under false charges. He was threatened by the police. He was put in prison. The church that he'd started and led was destroyed. And yet when he was in that cell, God spoke to him. He was released, I think, 6 days later after being locked up, and he's keeping on going. He's receiving support and food from Open Doors, from other Christians around the world. But how can he keep on going? Why is he doing that when everything's been taken away from him in his life? Why would he keep on going? It's the same attitude that Ruth had, because they know God is true, because they know God cares for his people, because they know Jesus is alive and he is the living God. And they know more than that we have a life in him for all eternity, a life held in his hands that can't be taken away. We're brought from death to life when we follow Jesus. We have an incredible inheritance waiting for us. And that begins now, even more extraordinary. It begins now. We live in Jesus Christ now. So no matter what happens in our lives, let's hold on to Jesus, because he holds on to us. Like it says in John's Gospel, chapter 10, I've written up there. These are the words of Jesus. I give them eternal life, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. No matter what happens in life, we're held in Jesus' hands. In Colossians, if you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast and not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard. That's what Pastor Laxman's doing. Standing firm, keeping going, not shifting from the hope of the gospel. It's the same attitude that Ruth has, to be determined, and let us have that same attitude as well. Standing firm, holding on to Jesus no matter where it takes us or what it might cost. Why? Because he's true, because he's alive, because he loves us and he has hold of us forever. But now move on to caring God, as we're going to look in more detail at Naomi. I think Naomi is a really interesting character. And Karen asked me a few questions about Naomi a couple of weeks ago. Disappointed she's not here today. Otherwise, she might ask a few questions again, because Naomi's really interesting. We read in verse 20 that when she returns to Bethlehem, which is a journey of about 7 or 10 days, she gets there and she changes her name from Naomi, which means pleasant, to Mara, which means bitter. And one of the questions that Karen asked me was, does that mean that Naomi has turned away from God, or that she's lost faith in God? I think that's a really interesting question. There's no doubt Naomi has had a really hard life. It's certain that what we read from chapter 1, that things really are bad. She's been left without her husband, without her 2 sons. She's got these 2 daughters-in-law that she feels responsible for, and she's got nothing in this country of Moab. A really hard life. We see how hard it is that even when she gets back to Bethlehem, the people there can hardly recognize her. They're asking, is this Naomi? Life has certainly taken its toll on Naomi, but what's her response? When she's in Moab, her response is to get back to God's people, to go back to God. So in some sense, perhaps they caused some of these problems themselves by leaving in the first place, by letting their sons marry against what God had said they should do. But their reaction is to go back to God. And we need to realize that no matter what happens in our life, no matter what state we're in, no matter even if we've caused some of the difficulties that we face, we can always go back to God. And the answer is always to turn to him. Not to stay in Moab, not even to go further and further away, but always to go back to God. And that question that Karen asked me is Naomi showing a lack of faith here when she feels the Lord has turned against her, when she says her life is bitter? Well, I think that rather than that, she's just being a real person. The text doesn't tell us she stopped believing in God. In fact, what she does say is that she knows, she understands that everything that happens is God's will. He's behind it all. He's still in control. She says in verse 13, the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. She says in verse 21, the Lord has brought me back empty. She says in verse 8, when she's speaking to Orpah and Ruth, may the Lord deal kindly with you. So the Lord is still very much in her thoughts. She knows that God is real. She knows that God is there. She knows that God is in control. But she doesn't really understand why all of this has happened to her. She doesn't understand why life is so hard and why she's suffering. because we need to be honest, hard times are tough. Let's not pretend they aren't. Let's not put on painted smiles and, as James was saying earlier, just pretend that everything's fine and that we're doing okay if we're not. Because as Christians, we still go through difficult periods just like everybody else does. And what should our reaction be? It shouldn't be to ignore it. It shouldn't be to pretend that what we're going through isn't happening or that everything's great. But what we do know as Christians, as followers of Jesus, is in tough times, that doesn't change that God is real. It doesn't change that God loves us. It doesn't change that God's in control. We'll have questions, of course we will. We won't understand everything that's happening. That's true. But let's be honest with God and with each other. Because one of the great things that we know as Christians is that we don't go through anything alone. Everything that happens, we go through with our God. Everything that happens, we go through with each other, with brothers and sisters that we have in Jesus. So if some of us are having a really good time, everything's going great, then let's look around. Let's see where there are opportunities for us to show our love and our care for each other, to pray for them, to encourage them. But if you're down, if you're struggling and things aren't going well, then remember you have a family here who want to help you, who want to care for you, who want to show you the love of God and to help keep you focused on the Lord. And I'm sure that was true of Naomi. Imagine how much of a lift it was to hear that Ruth was going back with her, to see Ruth determined to follow Jesus, or well, not Jesus in this case, but Ruth determined to follow the Lord and to turn to him. I'm sure that lifted Naomi enormously. It helped her, it reminded her, and we can do that for each other. And as I mentioned earlier, this chapter shows us that God cares for his people, demonstrated in him relieving them of the famine and providing food. So there was a period of hardship, and then the Lord brought blessing, just like he'd done all the way through the period of the judges. That's God's character. He's a caring God. He's a loving God. He provides for us. And ultimately, he saves us in Jesus Christ. So hold on to that. That's the character of the God we have. A God who loves us and has rescued us, and he doesn't change. And in Naomi's life, as I've said, she experienced real hardship. Her circumstances were terrible. But we see that there was help. At each and every stage, there were encouragements such as Ruth, and we'll find out in the weeks to come as we look at the later chapters, there was restoration. God provided a way for Naomi to experience his blessing again in her own life. God provided a way for Ruth to be elevated, for her status to be elevated, for her to be provided for, even for her to play a part in God's plan to redeem his people. And it reminds me of a couple of passages in John's Gospel. A few of them are well-known stories. You'll remember them. Jesus healed a man born blind. And before he did that, his disciples asked him, who sinned so that this man was born blind? Was it his parents? Did they sin? What was the reason for the man being born blind? And Jesus said, well, no, it wasn't because his parents sinned or anyone else sinned. The reason is so that the works of God might be displayed in him. And later, Jesus' friend Lazarus was ill, and that illness led to death. And when Jesus heard about the illness, his response was to say that this is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God himself might be glorified through him. So we see a glimpse here of why things happen when we usually don't understand why they're happening, so that God might be glorified by what he does in that situation. Now, there are many ways that could happen. It might be that God intervenes to change the circumstances miraculously, or it might be because he uses the difficult circumstances that we're in to teach us something, or to shape us, or to prepare us so that we can serve him in a different way in the future. God is always at work. We might not understand what he's doing or how he's going to act, but he's always at work in every situation. So the things we're going through might give us opportunities to meet people or to be witnesses to them so that we can see them come to faith. We don't know, but in everything that we're going through, our attitude should be to ask not what does this situation mean for me, but what is God doing in this situation to bring glory to his name. I put a picture up there of John F. Kennedy, and remember his famous speech, or one of his famous speeches, where he says, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's that same kind of question. In every day of our lives, everything we're going through, whether it's good times or bad times, as Christians, that should be our question. Ask not, what does this mean for me? But what is God doing here to bring glory to his name? And then crucially, how can I be a part of that? So when we're struggling, when we're going through difficulties, what do we do? Well, what we learn from the example here of Naomi and Ruth is remember that God is the same God always, a God of love and power and wisdom and goodness, a God we can rely on. What else can we do? We remember that we have an inheritance. There is a future coming for everyone who puts their trust in Jesus, an inheritance that we need to hold on to, an eternity with God, that sure and certain promise founded in the life, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. What else? Well, we rely on each other. The blessings we have by being part of God's family here on earth, to help each other, to come alongside each other, to lift each other up. And ultimately keep going by keeping our eyes on Jesus, what he's done already, what he is doing today, and what he will do in our lives and forever and evermore in the future. Even when we don't understand what's going on today or how we're going to get to that future inheritance that he has planned, keep our eyes on Jesus. And like Ruth, persevere, keep going. And also remember that God has a purpose and he's working it out all the time. I mentioned earlier at the start that Ruth comes up again in the book of Matthew in that line of Jesus' ancestry. She was one of Jesus' earthly ancestors. And this episode, it's just one episode in two women's lives. Might not seem of enormous significance, might not seem much in the grand scheme of things, but God used this. He used these two women to keep his plan moving. He had a purpose. He knew what was coming, an ultimate eternal purpose, and he used these two women to keep that plan moving along. So what we experience, what we face each day might not seem important. It might even seem meaningless. Yeah, it's important to us as individuals. But when we think, well, it's just the problems of one or two individual people, as Humphrey Bogart said, hill of beans, our experiences might not seem important. But God uses those everyday things. He uses people of faith who keep going when it isn't easy to play really important parts in the way that he acts in the world. Now we're looking at, on Wednesday nights, that series, I Am Andrew. And again, it's a similar thing. Andrew isn't one of the standout characters in the Bible. You might not think he did really significant things, but he brought other people to Jesus. He was there to support and to help, to do small things that Jesus used in incredible ways. So what can we do? For some of us, for all of us in fact, one of the big things we can do is just keep on going in our faith. Bring glory to God. Be used by him just by being available, being open to him, keeping on going, persevering. When our attitude every day is to ask, well, what's God doing here? And how can I be part of that? Just staying faithful, keeping our trust in him, our eyes on Jesus when things are difficult, that can be an incredible witness to the people around us, showing everyone that our God is worth following. He's an incredible, caring, loving God, a God who's involved in our lives day by day in real, practical ways. And I've put that verse up from Hebrews there, just as we come to finish, which is a long verse, but a good one to remember if you can, or to read regularly. It says that, therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. We are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls. The message there is the same as the message that we've read about in Ruth chapter 1 today. Keep on going. It speaks to the people around us when we keep our faith in Jesus, keep our eyes fixed on him. So let's not be those who shrink back and are destroyed, but let's be those who have faith and preserve their souls, having that same attitude, that same determination that Ruth had to follow the Lord.